Good evening and welcome to Global Lens News. I'm Sadia Afzal. For more than 75 years, Europe has lived under a security umbrella built largely by the United States. After the Second World War, America became the backbone of European defense. NATO was created to deter aggression. American troops were stationed across the continent, and Europe focused on rebuilding its economies while relying on Washington for much of its military security. But in 2026, a question that once seemed unthinkable is now being asked openly in European capitals. Can Europe defend itself if America steps back? This is no longer a theoretical debate taking place in think tanks or universities. It is shaping defense budgets, military planning, industrial policy, and diplomatic strategy across Europe. What we are witnessing today may be one of the biggest geopolitical transformations since the end of the Cold War. For decades, European governments assumed that if a major conflict erupted, the United States would always lead the response. That assumption shaped military spending, procurement, and strategic thinking. Today, that assumption is being questioned. Why? The answer lies in a combination of events that have unfolded over the past several years. Russia's invasion of Ukraine fundamentally changed Europe's perception of security. Suddenly, a large-scale conventional war returned to the European continent. Countries that had reduced defense spending after the Cold War realized that peace could no longer be taken for granted. At the same time, Washington's strategic priorities have begun to shift. The United States increasingly sees China as its primary long-term challenge. American military planners are developing greater attention to the Indo-Pacific, Taiwan, artificial intelligence, and competition with Beijing. This has led many European leaders to ask an uncomfortable question. If America's attention is increasingly focused on Asia, who will protect Europe? Adding to this uncertainty is the return of Donald Trump to the White House. Throughout his political career, Trump has repeatedly argued that European allies should shoulder more of their own defense burden. He has criticized NATO members for relying too heavily on American taxpayers and has insisted that Europe must invest far more in its own security. Whether one agrees with that position or not, it has had a profound effect. Across Europe, governments are responding by accelerating military investment at a pace not seen in decades. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte recently described this as the beginning of a defense industrial revolution. NATO alliance is pushing members toward dramatically higher long-term defense spending targets. Britain has unveiled one of its largest defense investment plans in modern history, emphasizing cyber capabilities, autonomous systems, submarines, and nuclear deterrence. Although a debate continues over whether the plan goes far enough, the direction is unmistakable. Defense is becoming a national priority once again. Germany, a country that for decades was cautious about expanding military power because of its history, is now moving in the opposite direction. For years, Germany was often criticized for spending far too little on defense. Today, Berlin is investing heavily in rebuilding its armed forces, modernizing equipment, and strengthening its defense industry. This represents a historic change. The Germany of 2026 is very different from the Germany of the previous 2 decades. France is also pushing for what President Emmanuel Macron has long called European strategic autonomy. The idea is simple. Europe should have the ability to defend itself, make independent security decisions, and maintain military capabilities, even if American support becomes limited. Years ago, this proposal was viewed by many as overly ambitious. Today, it is increasingly seen as necessary. Even countries that once opposed greater European military independence are beginning to reconsider. Why? Because uncertainty itself has become a strategic risk. Defense planners cannot build long-term strategies based on assumptions that may change after every election in Washington. If American priorities evolve, Europe needs alternatives. This does not mean Europe wants to replace NATO. Far from it. NATO remains the world's strongest military alliance. But European leaders increasingly believe they must become stronger partners rather than dependent allies. Recent discussions inside Europe increasingly focus on expanding domestic weapon production, improving military mobility, strengthening intelligence cooperation, and reducing dependence on American defense systems where possible. Another important factor is the war in Ukraine. European governments now provide a larger share of military assistance to Kyiv than ever before, while simultaneously replenishing their own stockpiles. The conflict has exposed weaknesses in ammunition production, logistics, and industrial capacity. Modern warfare consumes enormous quantities of drones, missiles, artillery shells, and advanced electronics. Countries cannot simply rely on existing inventories. They must build the industrial capacity to sustain prolonged conflicts if necessary. This explains why defense factories across Europe are expanding production. Military spending is no longer viewed only as a security expense. It is increasingly seen as industrial policy. Factories create jobs. Research creates innovation. Technology developed for defense often benefits civilian industries. This is one reason European governments increasingly present defense investment not only as a military necessity, but also as an economic opportunity. The numbers tell the story. Military expenditure across Europe has risen sharply, with the continent recording its highest defense spending ever. Analysts point to Russia's war against Ukraine and growing uncertainty about long-term American security guarantees as major drivers behind the increase. Yet, Europe still faces significant challenges. Despite increased spending, many critical capabilities remain heavily dependent on the United States. American intelligence, American satellite networks, American strategic airlift, American missile defense, American logistics, American command and control systems. Replacing these capabilities would require years of investment and unprecedented political coordination. Experts argue that while Europe can strengthen itself considerably, complete strategic independence cannot be achieved overnight. There is another obstacle. Europe is not a single country. It consists of sovereign nations with different political priorities, military traditions, and economic capacities. Poland's security concerns differ from Portugal's. France's strategic vision is not always identical to Germany's. Southern Europe faces different challenges from Northern Europe. Building a unified defense posture requires consensus among many governments. That is never easy. Yet, recent developments suggest Europe is becoming more united on one issue. Security can no longer be taken for granted. The NATO Summit this month reinforced this message, with allies discussing higher defense commitments, expanded industrial production, and continued support for Ukraine. What does all of this mean for the wider world? It means the international order is changing. For decades, the United States served as the undisputed security guarantor for much of the Western world. Now, Europe is preparing for a future in which it carries far greater responsibility for its own defense. That does not necessarily mean America is abandoning Europe, nor does it mean NATO is weakening. Instead, the alliance itself may be evolving. If Europe becomes more militarily independent, global diplomatic alignments may also shift. Resources, trade, technology, defense partnerships, all could be affected. The balance of global power is becoming more complex. Instead of one dominant security provider, the world may move toward a system where regional powers assume greater responsibility for their own neighborhoods. Europe in Europe, America in the Indo-Pacific, regional partnerships elsewhere. Whether this model produces greater stability or greater uncertainty remains to be seen. History often changes gradually before it changes suddenly. For many years, Europe's dependence on American security seemed permanent. Today, that permanence is being questioned. Perhaps the most important question is not whether Europe is preparing for a world without America. The more accurate question may be this: is Europe preparing for a world where America remains an ally but no longer carries the same burden it once did? If that is the future, then Europe's military transformation is not a sign of divisions across the Atlantic. It is a sign that the global balance of power is entering a new era, one in which every major region is being forced to take greater responsibility for its own security. And that may become one of the defining geopolitical stories of the next decade. This is Sadia Afzal for Global Lens News.